Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Glad to know you're still there with us. And now to our big story for today, which is to look at the drive to eliminate hunger by the year 2030. According to United Nations, the drive to eliminate hunger, according to a special report released by the United Nations, is being stalled because it's looking practically impossible to achieve the target set for the year 2030. Statistics released by the United Nations states that 1 in 11 people experience hunger globally, and 1 in 5 when it comes to Africa experience hunger. In fact, in the year 2023, about 733 million people faced hunger globally. What is responsible for this development, and what can be done to ensure that the SDG goal number 2 is achieved by the year 2030? Let's bring the perspective of our special guest who joins us in the studio. We're being joined by Maurice Ekpong, who is Executive Director, African Journal for Sustainable Development. Glad to have you join us this morning.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
And good to see you again.
Thank you.
Reunion of friends.
Good morning, Maurice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, it's just disturbing that we have to start on this note because in line with what we preach, which is to shape policy, we just have to look at this development. The special report released by the United Nations stating that the drive to eliminate hunger by the year 2030 is being stalled. It's practically looking impossible. And I want us to play with these statistics that 1 in 11 people globally face hunger, while in Africa, in our continent, 1 in 5, faces hunger. Give us a picture of how it has gotten to this level and the drive to eliminate hunger globally. How successful or unsuccessful you think it has been?
Thank you. That's a very important question there. As we all know, the bid to eliminate hunger by 2030 is one of the SDGs. Hunger is a problem found across the world, but particularly in Africa. Africa is if you like, you can call it the hunger capital of the world. About 20% from the statistic you reeled out of the hunger challenges are in Africa. So to your question, why are we where we are? If you look at it from the perspective of the world, some improvements have happened, particularly in, say, Latin America, right? In Asia, it's stalled. There's been not much movement in terms of the drive to achieve the goal of eliminating hunger by 2030. While in Africa, it continues to worsen. So, from a global perspective, that's the trend. So what are the key drivers of hunger? Conflict, economic crisis, and climate change. From the report, that you just quoted, are the main drivers of hunger. So where you have a lot of conflicts displacing people, right? Those places are going to be pockets of very hungry populations. Economic crisis such as we have across the world in Nigeria, also heightens hunger. Because one of the key things, when it comes to eliminating hunger is affordability, accessibility. These things are driven by money. You need money to buy food, right? You need a job to be able to buy food. So where there is economic crisis, you are not going to be able to afford food, and then it's going to impact the level of food insecurity at the household level. So that's and of course, climate change. Climate change is a major driver, right? Where you have too much rain or too little rain, particularly for countries like in sub-Saharan Africa that is completely dependent on natural elements for agriculture, right? Those shocks will definitely affect production from an agricultural level, and therefore how much food goes to the market and is available to people.
All right, let's look at some of the reasons that you've given for the increased hunger in the world, and
Yes.
looking at Africa. So if we look at conflict, which is one of the reasons that you gave, and how it has affected food availability in Africa, I like to make a comparison between Africa and Ukraine, which is presently at war with Russia. So Ukraine is at war with Russia, yet it still produces food that it sells outside of Ukraine. And if you look right now, you can't actually point to a war situation in most parts of Africa, except there are internal conflicts, which is not as immense as what you have in Ukraine. So, could we then say that conflict is the major issue why there is hunger in Africa, or there are underlying issues that conflict has further made worse?
That's a very good point there, because from high level, right? The report says conflict is a driver. Conflict is definitely a driver, but to compare Ukraine and Africa is a good point. Ukraine does high tech agriculture. You understand? Where you have, of course, the land ownership. One person can have access to thousands of hectares of land, right? And they are farming large scale. So one conflict can't quite impact food production at that level. But where you have a lot of smallholders, right, in particular locations, and conflicts displace people at those locations, it will affect. So we're not doing a lot of commercial scale agriculture in Nigeria. Bulk of the food we produce comes from smallholders. Up to 90% of what is produced. If you look at, say, the oil palm sector, 70% of the oil palm sector is driven by smallholders. People who own one plot, half a plot, an acre. So any small conflict in those areas would affect those people, as against high-tech guys that do thousands of hectares. So like you rightly said, Ukraine is in war with Russia, but it's still producing a lot of wheat. As a matter of fact, I think it was last year that they donated wheat to Nigeria, donated stuff to food to Nigeria. So that happens because they do a lot of high-tech commercial scale farming. But in Nigeria, we are mostly smallholders. So a conflict in, say, the Northeast that displaces people in that belt will definitely affect everybody else across the country.
All right, let me point your attention to a very sensitive statement made by the director of the UN Food and Agri Organization.
Yeah.
And I would like you to listen. Said, we are in a worse situation today than nine years ago when we launched this goal to eradicate hunger by 2030. Same challenges such as climate change and regional wars are grown more severe than envisaged a decade ago. Now, he's trying to paint a picture that what we have now is more severe than what was emergent when this goal was launched 9 years ago. What will you say about the level of preparation as regards, the drive to eliminate hunger? Would you say there was no proper commitment? If this was launched 9 years ago and by now we're not making headway, would you attribute that to underrating the level, the magnitude of the challenges, or not having a proper grip on some of the factors or the preparations that should have been put in place to be able to manage what we have now?
Okay, that's a good question. What are the challenges? Yes, these goals were conceived about 9 years ago, right? And of course, nobody has a crystal ball that tells you exactly what's going to happen in the future. So every goal should be how do I say, dynamic, right? So you change your strategy based on the challenges that you face. But you find there are many things that have changed since 9 years when this goal was conceived. Nobody anticipated COVID. COVID set the world back by maybe another 5 years, or God knows how many years, right? And then so many other factors, Ukraine war that happens afterwards, and all the conflicts, from across the world, across sub-Saharan Africa, Sudan, the Sahel region, Boko Haram, terrorists in Nigeria and all of that. So all of these were not anticipated, right? So what we need to do now is to go back to the drawing board. It is very clear that we are not likely to achieve the goal to end hunger by 2030. So what can we do? What palliatives can we put in place, right? So we need to go back to the drawing board. If you take Nigeria, for instance, now Nigeria and most other African countries have a challenge. Like the statistics said, 20% of global hunger is in Africa. What must we begin to do? We must begin to go into massive agriculture. You have lands, say in Sambisa. The lands in Sambisa forest, that area that is taken over by terrorists now, are extremely fertile lands. And from there, you can produce enough food to feed almost half of Nigeria.
But
So
nobody will dare that in the
Yeah.
face of insecurity
Yeah,
in that forest.
so our military forces are there to protect the territorial integrity of Nigeria. Nothing stops the army from providing that in that area, providing security in a place like Sambisa, so that farmers can go and farm. There are terrorists in Nigeria now that are taxing farmers. They are a government unto themselves. So before you go to your farm, you have to pay a tax to them. So if terrorists that are not as armed or as competent as the Nigerian military can do that, why can't the Nigerian military secure a territory and have farmers go and farm in those areas?
All right, talking about securing territories, which is something that we leave to the military to do. But while there are places to be reclaimed from the terrorists, there are also places that are available, but they are not fertile as they used to be due to climate issues. And there are also other climate conditions that threaten agricultural production, such as flooding, which we found to have taken over the farm spaces and even already produced farm agricultural produce. So what can be done to ensure that there is preparation for such climatic conditions that they do not affect food production as we see them happen?
It's difficult to preempt climatic conditions, right? Of course, you can look at meteorology, you can forecast weather, you can say how much rain is likely to fall based on past trends and all of that. But so I think we need to use all of that technology, right, to plan our agricultural development. The government has records of places that are prone to flooding, right? The government has records of places that are prone to drought, right? And there are crops that can do well in some of those areas, right? Drought-prone areas, there are certain things that might be able to do well. A crop like cassava is very resistant or tolerant to drought. So we can cultivate some of these crops in those places. So I really think the big challenge that we face, particularly in Africa, is that of proper planning and execution, of our development plans. We are very skittish when it comes to planning, right? We talk a lot about what we can do, but when it comes to brass tags, we are not really on the ground as a people. So we must begin to plan using data, right? We must begin to plan using data. What crops can we grow in what particular locations? What crops can we grow in our wetlands, right? What crops can we grow in our dry areas? What crops, do you understand? And basically maximize this. And then another thing we need to also look at, which I think you mentioned in a bit, is the issue of land ownership, because that's also a big problem. In Nigeria, you have smallhold, people owning small lands. So it's very difficult for you to go in and do large scale cultivation without resolving all those land ownership issues, right? So there's a lot of work we need to do to be able to free up agricultural land, and to be able to implement our agricultural development plans as a people.
Now, let's look at some of the critical factors. One of them is the issue of poverty, which is quite peculiar to our continent. I would like us to look at the role of poverty in these, looking at the present economic realities, even for the rich also crying because the purchasing power is being eroded. Now, how will that complicate the effort to eliminate hunger by the year 2030, and what can be done to eliminate this kind of challenge which is quite peculiar to our continent?
Yeah, so there are a number of drivers of hunger. One driver of hunger is household size. You understand? Somebody that has just one mouth to feed is not likely to be as at risk as when you were probably single.
Yeah.
You can survive on 001. But once you have a wife and a child, you can't. So the level of hunger increases with size of family. Another driver to hunger is also poverty, like you have said, because you know poverty speaks to purchasing power. How much money you have to buy, right? To buy food, for instance. So the issues of poverty have to be addressed. And how can you address poverty? In Nigeria, there have been issues, there have been plans, to do some cash transfers direct to beneficiaries as a palliative. But that's just palliative. You understand? Cash transfers can't end poverty, long sustainably. You understand? So we need to talk about empowerment. How can people get employed? Right? I'm not talking about unemployment. I'm not talking about somebody selling handkerchiefs in traffic, right, and earning say less than $1 a day. That's not empowerment in any way. I'm talking about people living, earning a livable wage, a wage that they can live on. So once you address the issues of poverty, and the root causes, unemployment and all of that, lack of education, lack of skills. Once you address those problems, right, you address poverty, and therefore you address people's ability to buy food and end hunger as individuals and as households. So yeah, poverty is a big driver, and that has to be addressed if hunger has to be tackled effectively.
Addressing the issues beginning from the size of the household.
Yes.
Don't you think that would be quite a challenge in a place like Africa, where there is the belief that God brings children, and so God takes care or provide for the children? How do we go about this? There have been campaigns by National Population Commission in Nigeria, for instance, about the need for family planning, but the messages seem to be falling on deaf ears, particularly in some regions of the country.
Yeah, so people must cut their coats according to their cloth. Do you understand? I mean, otherwise you'll keep getting poverty, hunger spiraling out of control, poverty spiraling out of control. If you look at the statistics, I can't say precisely what it is now, but you find that even within Nigeria, even within a state like Lagos, even within particular local governments, the more well-to-do have fewer children, right? And the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid tend to have a lot more children. So why is that? Why is that? We must examine those indices critically, right? I think overall, it's difficult for Nigerians and Africans to accept that they need to do family planning, but I think that's the way to go. People need to control how many children they have. You understand? So that they don't throw those children and those families into cycles of poverty and hunger, right? That's about what we can say. You can't force people to say you must have one child, or you must have 2 children, or you know.
But talking about forcing, maybe not outrightly forcing, but coming up with policies and incentive. China did that at a time where there was a policy to control birth rates.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So China's policy, to a large extent, may have paid off. But if you look at the fact that their population is declining now, you see
after several years,
maintaining the policy, you see that it is not exactly a silver bullet. There's a way. I think we need to go back to the drawing board and rejig the policy. It may not be outrightly accepting the kind of approach that China did, but we must look at something that works for Africa, right? The African likes plenty children, but we don't live in the age of our grandfathers where farming, it made economic sense to have a lot of children when you were doing farming, because, those children were part of the labor, right? But now, if you live in a place like Lagos, what's the economic sense in having plenty children? Do you understand? Where you don't have farm, where you don't have a farm to deploy them to. So I think we need to look at our policy. Yes, we need some sort of family planning. We need that advocacy, but we also need something that works for us so that we don't find ourselves in the challenge that China and even a country like Japan has, where they have dying populations.
Now, let's get back to the issue of climate change, which we know globally is a call of nature. But if you look at the approach to tackling climate change in other in large economies, you will understand that Africa needs to learn a lot from them. Let's talk about the issue of climate financing, which has also been challenging over the years. How do we channel these things towards improving the challenges being posed by climate change, looking at the peculiarities of the climate change issues that Africa face? Let's talk about the right financing and the framework to tackling the peculiarity of climate change issues in Africa?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Climate finance is like the climate finance ecosystem is like every other business, right? That follows or that pursues good business propositions, right? So if you look at the global flow of capital, you find that a lot is not coming in Africa's direction. I did a report about that not too long ago, right? Most of the climate finance in the world is even going towards the major pollutants. Africa contributes less than 5% to global to greenhouse gas. I think about 2% or thereabout, right? And is disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change, which means Africa is most affected by climate change, right? But the major pollutants, like countries in Asia, India, China, that are the major pollutants, right, are the ones getting the bulk of climate financing.
Why is that so?
Because they have a business strategy. They have a strategy. You understand? Which is why I said that climate finance goes after right business strategies. So African governments, and Africa as a continent, maybe the African Union, needs to have a very clear climate financing strategy. And then coming down to the countries, every country needs to have a clear, make a very clear funding strategy so that the ecosystem is not opaque. Because funding will not just follow wishes, right? They would follow very clearly constructed ecosystems that has what do you call it now? A very clear path of return for whoever is investing. Because the bulk of this climate funding available, goes to businesses, right, that expect a return on investment. Some of it is aid, right? But all of that typically follows good business propositions. So governments in Africa need to be very clear and look at climate funding as a business and create the enabling environment to attract the funding like they are doing in Asia, where the big pollutants are coming from.
Talking about pollutants, we do not have polluters just outside of Africa. We also have local polluters doing their own. Now, in terms of strategy, what kind of planning should Africa have to ensure that areas that are supposed to serve as food production, not just land, but even water, are preserved? They are not more exposed to climatic conditions that could change their state and make it impossible for them to become production grounds. For instance, the water. We have some companies dumping their waste in the rivers, in the seas in Africa. We have also some practices that makes it very easy for land to have erosion problem and even to have gully problems. What kind of planning we have in Nigeria? We have Ministry of Regional and Urban Planning. We have those kinds of ministries with different names in parts of Africa. What should be the policy? What should be the strategy, the responsibility of Africa towards securing internally its own space?
Yeah, so Africa's problem has been far from one of policy, right? Look at Nigeria, for instance, right? You mentioned all these ministries, Ministry of Water Resources. You have agencies responsible for irrigation, manning the waterways. You have, you have policies that mandate companies to do ESIAs, environmental and social impact assessments, before doing projects. So, but the challenge is always one of enforcement, right? In America, anybody will commit a crime if they believe that they will not be caught. Same with, anywhere in Europe, right? Same with anywhere in Asia. People naturally want to do whatever they like to do, but are sort of like restricted based on their fear of being caught, fear of being apprehended. So the challenge is really one of enforcement, right? How do you enforce some of these laws? How do you mandate companies to not throw garbage into the seas? How do you make sure your country is not a dumping ground for some of this industrial waste that, affects the ecosystem? Do you understand? Look at you remember when in Japan there was the earthquake that caused the nuclear reactors, that happened in Japan, and there was a problem with one of the nuclear power plants, right? They were, countries that usually buy things like fish and agricultural products from Japan, insisted that if that entire ecosystem was not properly cleaned, they won't buy from them again, right? But in Nigeria, we don't ask those questions. We allow whatever to happen in our environment without repercussions to anybody. As long as somebody can bribe somebody in government, anything goes. So we really need to enforce. And then again, because of the peculiarities of the challenges we are having with climate change and some of these environmental challenges, I think we need to also rework our frameworks, our policy, you understand, to make sure that it is consistent with the current realities we are facing.
All right, now let's focus on food production. You're aware we're at a time where farmers, even manufacturers, and even producers are not being motivated to go into production due to insecurity, not having access to the right financing, and even the cost of doing business. What incentives do you think government can put in place to encourage farmers to go into production, manufacturers to go into business, looking at the present economic realities and some of the challenges peculiar to the cost of doing businesses? Because if food production is not being achieved, the drive to eliminate hunger, it will be impossible.
Yeah. So that's a good question right there. What kind of incentives? Farming is like any other business, right? What's the number one concern of the farmer? The number one concern of the farmer is that he produces what he produces and then he sells, right? He doesn't want losses in between. He doesn't want maybe rodents or pests to destroy his crops when he plants. He doesn't want his produce to be lost due to maybe invasion or climate change. And then he doesn't want to produce something, and then when he goes to the market, the cost is, he doesn't sell and make enough money to recoup his investment. So that's the concern of the farmer. So what can government do, you understand, to mitigate some of those concerns? One of it is to say, look, whatever you produce, we'll buy at X. You understand? So even if the farmer produces, say, 1 bag of cassava, right, and the current market price is less than what he produced, government should be able to buy and enable him to make profit. So government should be sort of like an off-taker. So maybe there should be some kind of marketing boards that buys this thing, sort of like subsidizing the farmer so that he can go out and produce. During Obasanjo's regime, remember there was this call for everybody to go and produce cassava because, you could produce bread, make bread from cassava. And so all the farmers went to produce cassava, and there was a glut in the market, right? And because of the glut, farmers could not sell. So the next year, everybody said, we're not going to produce this cassava. So once there's that kind of policy failure, you will have ripple effects because you will not be able to convince the farmer to go back to farm. So there has to be guaranteed prices for farmers, right? And that's so if there's anything we must subsidize production. And production at the farm level, at the agricultural level, is very important. So we must find ways and means to give confidence to our farmers to produce. If it means giving them inputs, if it means off-taking their products, if it means providing security for them, all of those must be put in place so that the farmer can have the confidence to produce.
All right. So after the farmers are encouraged to produce food in abundance, let's look at one aspect of the sustainable development goals too. We talk about ending hunger and ensuring that people have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food all year round. The quality of the produce themselves, and even the value chain when several products are extracted from this produce. The quality of the product. Now, Nigeria opens its borders to imports of food from different parts of Africa to complement what farmers in here or those who are into agricultural production are able to do. We find also that there is forced ripening of certain farm produce. It has become a norm. You want to buy plantain, you want to buy fruits, vegetables, particularly fruits these days. It's hard for you to know which one was ripened naturally or was forced using several other methods and chemicals and all that. The safety or the wholesomeness of the food that is being consumed in Africa. It is one thing to eat, it's another thing for the food that you eat to be safe and nutritious to your body rather than becoming a toxic to your system.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like I said earlier, anybody will commit a crime if they think they will get away with it, right? The people who do some of these things do so because they want to make a quick buck, right? They may want to make ends meet. So the onus is on regulatory authorities to make sure that, food that comes to the people is controlled, right? And monitored for quality. You understand? I mean, you can't change people overnight. Poverty drives people to do a lot of things, right? But what can regulatory authorities do? That's the question. You have like NAFDAC, right? And you have a lot of other agencies that are saddled with the responsibility of making sure that quality comes to the table. I think we need to do a lot of enforcement, right? We need to do a lot of enforcement. We need to, perhaps it might be difficult, maybe ban some of those chemicals that are used to force ripen, some of these fruits and all of that. So we need to look at all of that from a policy point of view to make sure that we control quality. Don't forget that Nigerian beans was rejected sometime in Europe because of the quantity of chemicals, pesticides in it. You understand? So even from the farm gate, I think a lot of extension service needs to be done to educate farmers. What quantity of herbicides do you have to use? How do you apply it? You understand? At what point do you apply it? You understand? How frequently do you apply it? Because all of this goes to impact the toxicity level in the food that comes to the table at the end of the day. So a lot of education needs to be done. A lot of reorientation needs to be done. A lot of empowerment needs to be done. So if we are really serious, there's a lot of work to be done, and we must get to it.
When we talked about the need for people to grow what they eat, the need to have like a backyard kind of farming, whereby you have control over your basic needs and some other things. Talk to us. How practical or achievable is this, and how will it play out in tackling the issue of hunger?
Yeah, so food security, a big aspect of food security that is sometimes overlooked is the need for people to grow at least part of what they consume. Now, this is easily implemented in rural areas where there's a lot of land, but in urban settings like Lagos, like Port Harcourt, it may, with the crowd and population, but we find that people can still do something. You can grow vegetables in a pot. You can grow, for instance, ugu in a sack. You can even plant yam and potatoes and carrots and onions at your backyard, right? You can raise a few chickens. Do you understand? You can raise a few chickens, buy it. I don't know how much they sell one day old chick now, maybe 500, maybe 1,000 naira, and then feed it off the scraps of food that come from your kitchen. You don't need to buy anything. And then after 6 months, that becomes something that you can use on the table. So there's a lot that needs to be done, that can be done by individuals to at least mitigate some of the risks so that you are not 100% dependent on the market for everything. You can plant ugu, right? You can plant water leaf. You can plant, other vegetables. You can even plant carrots. There's a lot that the individuals can do with the small spaces that they have, so that they are not 100% dependent on the external market. Imagine a situation if there's a siege, right, and food can't come from the north to the south, or if there is a disaster in say farming communities somewhere, and food
distribution.
so there's a disruption in food distribution networks. What will the individuals do? So we must be able to produce some of the things that we consume ourselves. So I think that's the assignment that each household in Lagos or in the major cities across Africa can do. Find a way to produce part of what you eat so that you are not 100% dependent on other people.
Taking it from where you left off, finding a way to produce some of what we eat. I think that message became more profound with the scarcity of tomatoes. Now that the reliance used to be from the north, people rely on supply of tomatoes from the north. But when it became very scarce and expensive commodities, some people had to start growing some of that at the backyard, and then you see different varieties, different species of tomatoes. But looking at that at a national level and at a continental level, wheat is more like it's becoming more like staple food in Africa, being that it is used for the production of several other food that is being consumed in Africa. But most of the supply comes from outside of Africa because the domestic production is not sufficient. Now, how do we intentionally prioritize the production of staple food so that there is abundance of that domestically and the reliance is not from supply outside of Nigeria and Africa, using rice and some other food as examples?
Yeah, so that's a very important question, and it's a kind of paradox, you understand, to see that Africa has the largest share of uncultivated arable land in the world. At least 20% of land that has not been cultivated, that is arable, that is left in the world, is in Africa. You have water, and then when you need to do agriculture, what do you need? You need water and land, and you have all of this in Africa. So we can be self-sufficient as a continent if the right strategy and policies are in place, right? So let's backtrack. What do we eat the most, right? In Nigeria, staples, like you mentioned, cassava is a big staple that we consume. We are we are the biggest producers of cassava in the world, right? But we don't get as much value from cassava as other countries that produce fewer than us, because we don't take advantage of the value chain, right? So how can we cultivate more cassava? Because cassava is like an insurance crop. Even though right now, Gary is even as expensive or even more expensive as rice. You understand? So we must produce a lot more of that. What are the other crops that can grow in drought-prone areas? You can produce cassava. You can produce cowpea. You can produce a lot of stuff. Ditto, other African continents, other African countries need to look at what works for us. What do we produce more? And how can we produce more of this so that we don't depend on this? Because I'm telling you, Ukraine, the world is going to see a lot more conflicts this decade. Ukraine, Russia may not be the only war. COVID-19 may not be the only pandemic. There will be more. So when there are disruptions in the global supply chain like we had during COVID, what happens to Africa that is 100% dependent on purchases from external? So the shocks will be too much for us. We need to go back to the drawing board and produce a lot more of what we consume so that we are not reliant on, Europe, on America. You understand? On Asia, that a lot of the times dump second-handed agricultural produce that they won't even eat in their place in Africa. Do you understand? So food security speaks to, backward integration, producing what you consume. so that you are not prone to the shocks of the external market.
All right, now let's come to the Nigerian space now. I want us to be very particular about our country now. You're aware of the hunger in the land. It's an open secret, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, it's a reality. I don't know if someone have asked you for urgent 2K in recent times, but that's playing out because there's severe hunger in the land. And if you look at the protest scheduled for tomorrow, which is not our focus, but you discover that one of the things fueling this pocket of protest has to do with the issue of hunger. Now, if you're in position to advise the federal government, let me put you on the spot now. What kind of short-term initiative do you think it can put in place to alleviate poverty, the issue of hunger, to address that, let's say in the next 3 months or in the next 6 months, like a short-term intervention to address the issue of hunger?
Yeah, technology, okay, so we are not exactly reinventing the wheel. When we look at the issue of hunger at a global level, you see that Latin America has made progress, a lot of progress. The reason Latin America has made progress is because they have a very advanced social safety network, social safety protection system. So they have that, right? So they can quickly, using technology, because they know who is hungry, who is poor, they know the location, they have the bank account of the person,
They have the data.
they have the database, they can immediately end hunger by sending those cash transfers. Now, while we have that database in Nigeria, right, the problem of corruption makes it very difficult, because 90% or 95% of what is allocated to address hunger, will be diverted by politicians and people in positions of trust. So what can be done? What can be done? You have the database of Nigerians, right? You have their, BVNs. The best I know, nobody can have 2 BVNs, right? You have the data, you have this database. We need to clean that database and make sure that that data has integrity. Take a baseline assessment of the most vulnerable people in society. You can break this thing down. It's not rocket science. You know the local government. You know how many houses are in each ward. You know how many households are in each local government. You can do an enumeration. You have this census data. Go there, find out from the people. You can commission consultants, right, to go and get data from the people. How many people live in your household? And then Nigerians also have to be upright, because we also lie. By the time the government wants to take a census of people that are hungry, people will register their late grandmother and all of that. So we need to tell the truth. If we can adopt the strategy of Latin America, it's easy for anybody that wants to help people to do an instant transfer to them, and they can have money to buy these things, just like they have done in Latin America. If we don't have integrity in our system, then it is difficult to address hunger in 3 months. It's absolutely impossible. But if we leverage technology and we have people of integrity to man the system, then you can alleviate hunger, you can alleviate poverty.
It is important that the problem of hunger is tackled, because you know what they say, a hungry man is an angry man. So the conflict that is even making the food scarce, when people get very hungry, it can escalate to more conflict, and that means the food becomes less in availability or in supply. Thank you very much, Maurice Ekpong, who is a development expert, has been talking with us today on the hunger issue, even as the UN says that the efforts to tackle hunger and bring it to an end by 2030 have been stalled. Look at the issues that are stalling the progress in that direction and the way forward.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.